Welcome to the Museum of Woman Hour, where we bring you the thoughts of fascinating people who not only know how to transform the world for the better, but are actively doing so. Today, it is our great honor to speak with Reverend Dr. Karen Tate, a woman who has, in my observation and personal experience, changed the lives of so many with her work. She is a popular thought leader, speaker, 7 times published author, podcaster, interfaith leader, and social justice activist. She is also a caring economy conversation leader and a power of partnership presenter. And you might want to look into that. That's some pretty interesting stuff. She has a certification from Smith College in the psychology of political activism, women changing the world. And she certainly is. She can be seen also in the award-winning docufilm. And if you haven't seen it, highly recommended, Femme, Women Healing the World. It's really a fascinating film. She has been named one of 13 most influential women in goddess spirituality. And her newest book, which I'm very excited about, Normalizing Abuse, a commentary on our pervasive culture of abuse. This, her newest book, has just been published, and her long-running podcast, Voices of the Sacred, is returning to, I assure you, a very happy audience. Her books include Sacred Places of Goddess, 108 Destinations, Walking an Ancient Path, Goddess Calling, Voices of the Sacred Feminine, Conversations to Change Our World, Awakening the Feminine, Goddess 2.0. Her latest book, as we say, Changing the World, is Normalizing Abuse, a commentary on the culture of pervasive abuse. And I feel that never was such a book more needed now to help us all understand what is happening in our world that seems to be so abusive on so many levels, personally, politically, in so many ways. Normalizing abuse is for those interested in the intersection between social justice, self-help, and alternative spirituality. It speaks to how society is rife with trauma and abuse that many of us, perhaps most of us, don't actually recognize as such. It helps readers see clearly what is trauma and abuse, identify the cause, and have the tools to transform how they react personally to abusive situations. There's already a great deal of praise for the book. The legendary Riane Eisler, you'll know that name, from Chalice and the Blade and other fantastic books, says, this is what Riane says, and I quote, Karen Tate has given us an important book that recognizes that personal abusive behavior is not an isolated event. It is embedded in a culture that we must change from domination to partnership, a moving and inspiring book, end quote. That's from Riane Eisler, author of The Chalice and the Blade. Karen, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ava. I'm really have been looking forward to doing this. I've done a lot of interviews for the book, but to see a colleague on the other side and a familiar face, it makes it that much more fun.
Very good. Many of our followers know you, Karen, from your decades of priestess work in goddess community and your wonderful classes, your presentations and events, many of which I've experienced myself over 2 decades at many places, including the Museum of Woman. I have heard women say that what they learned from you altered the direction of their lives, which I think is pretty amazing and absolutely true. You were one of the first women leaders I encountered when I started learning about some of these things that you teach. And I was just awestruck by the events, the historical accuracy of the events that you created. You did alter the direction of my life. So I can well understand that many women feel that way. Some people might be aware that you sort of went off the grid for a few years, somewhere around 2018, until you were back recently in the public eye teaching and podcasting again, I think in January of this year. And with your return, we are very excited about this new book of yours. Can you tell us, did you go off grid to write the book? What happened?
Oh, if only that were why I went off grid. No. Unfortunately, it was really two life-changing events that altered, my husband Roy and I's trajectory. We had an idea of, what our future was going to be, and it turned out circumstances changed all that, and the first thing that was a catalyst for me going off the grid was I was attacked by someone wielding a stun gun. And it was shocking, really, because the person who came after me was not anyone that looked like a hoodlum. They weren't wearing a hoodie, or wasn't in the dark of night or anything like that. It was actually a young woman who could have been in college. It was in broad daylight. And it was just a crazy random thing. I think she must have been drunk or on drugs. She thought I had her phone, and I'd never seen the girl before in my life. And she kept insisting I had her phone, and nothing I could say would change her mind. And when I couldn't produce the phone, she hit me with the stun gun. And
what an experience. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, literally chasing me down the hall, doing this with the stun gun, trying to get me, and I'm just out of her reach. And, it was pretty traumatic.
Indeed. It must have been horrifying and completely, I would think, completely traumatizing.
Well, that's the funny thing about this, Ava. I didn't realize what it did me for a while. I didn't feel like I had to go to the hospital because there was any physical injury. And I didn't comprehend that the changes that were happening in me psychologically, in the coming months and couple years, had anything to do with the stun gun attack. But I realized my world started to contract, started to have nightmares. I started catastrophizing. I always thought, I became fearful. I didn't want to go places where there were a lot of strangers. While I was trying to figure that all out, the other thing that happened was Roy fell and hit his head and had a brain injury. And it took a year for worker comp to really step up and do what he needed. A year. I mean, such an egregious system. Talk about abuse. But he was in brain boot camp for 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, which helped him tremendously. But it was like flipping a switch. That was the final straw that really catapulted us into this downward spiral for a while. We left LA. We had no jobs. We had no income, and we ended up at a place, 2 hours, north of, Los Angeles. And that's where we went off the grid. We were in healing mode. We were in reflection mode, just trying to figure it all out, to heal, to decide what our next steps were going to be. It was a double-edged sword. The isolation was difficult, but on the other hand, I think the isolation also made it easy to reflect and heal. We were also safer during COVID because, Roy will tell you, he didn't speak to anybody for 3 years except me and doctors. We had our food delivered, all that stuff. At some point, during my process of healing myself, I started writing Normalizing Abuse, because I realized that it was, in a way, was a continuation of what I had been teaching, sometimes at the Goddess Temple, the Museum of Woman. It was really kind of a continuation of the partnership ideas that I learned, by way of Riane Eisler and caring economy, our real wealth, the partnership way, all of those. But I was peeling the layers of the onion back, I think, more and more, and looking at it more deeply, because I was a social justice activist before, but now I was also an abuse survivor. And I was seeing things on a different level. That's what I wanted to talk about in the book, because I could see that I didn't realize I had been abused. I thought I was just out there maybe helping other women to see abuse in their life. And when I saw how it crept up on me, that was like this huge aha moment. And so it, led to the book.
So really, you used an abusive and traumatic situation and event in your life. You turned it into something beneficial for the world. That's the way it appears to me. And thank you. Thank you for being the kind of woman who can do that, because not everybody has that awareness or that capability. But you have taken this situation and abuse and trauma, and you have created something that can help other women.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I've always been in goddess spirituality, and especially the social justice aspects of it, to help other people, because I realized what an impact it had on my life, how it changed me. And so this was sort of the, just the next step, the next evolution for me. And look, I'm a human being too. I'm not trying to, there were days when I was angry and bitter, felt abandoned, neglected, betrayed, but I was really able to turn it around and make lemonade out of lemons. I really look back on everything that we went through in hindsight, and it was a gift. We are in such a good place now. I don't believe there was any way this would have happened. We would be where we are if all of those horrible things had not preceded our life today.
Yes, absolutely. You have described the last few years of your life as a journey of awakening. I'm sure you have some memorable events to share in your life that set you on this personal path of discovery. Can you comment on a couple of them, perhaps?
Part of the healing journey was it was a lot of reflection. It was going back in time and looking at situations with fresh eyes, really looking at situations through a lens of, well, what was that about? I mean, I can remember when I was, I think I was 9, and I was sitting in the doctor's office on these horrible orange plastic chairs for about an hour waiting for us to be called. I didn't even know I was there for myself. I thought I was there for my mom because the doctor was her doctor. And suddenly, we're called into into the exam room. I'm laid down on the table. And suddenly I'm having a vaginal exam at 9. I think I was probably traumatized. I remember crying and screaming, and this doctor's face was contorted and ugly. And the nurse and my mother were there in the room off to the side, just kind of looking the other way, like they couldn't even bear to look at what was happening. And it's funny now, in a way. I'm funny, but the color orange, and I think it's from those orange chairs. When I see the color orange today, I am totally nauseated.
It really shows you how trauma lives in our physical bodily experience, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened as a young child. We were in Hurricane Betsy, the water went to the rooftops of our house, and my stepdad had to. There was one 2-story building in the neighborhood, so everybody was trying to get into that 2-story apartment complex. I remember my dad had me, my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother. He had to keep walking back and forth between our house and the the two-story to try to get us to safety. And with every trip he took, the water was rising higher and higher and higher till, the very last trip he had my mother and our cat. And my mother's hanging on to his neck and holding on to the cat. And he's up to his neck in this dirty, murky, water moccasin filled water, trying to make it in that current from our house to the two-story duplex. I didn't know if they were going to live or die.
Right.
So there are things that happen, and like all of us, but they leave their mark. And I think unless we go back and look at what has happened to us and how it might have affected us, we can continue to act out of that trauma. I mean, I had a complicated relationship with my mother, and I felt, well, when I got away from her, it would all be over. But no, the wounds are still there. You can put a Band-Aid on it, but something will happen and trigger you. And the wound is right there gaping and oozing again because you haven't dealt with it and healed from it. And it can affect how you see yourself. It can affect how you see other people around you. And more importantly, the decisions you make. Because I look back now and I truly believe that the insecurities that I developed because of things that happened in my childhood caused me to not realize when I needed to walk away from toxic relationships. Instead, I maybe blame myself. I wasn't a good enough friend. I didn't work hard enough. It was all on me. At least I was making it all about me, rather, because of my insecurities, rather than seeing the toxic person for who they were and just walking away. The way I came to that was really with a past life regression. During the healing process, I did past life regressions, I did shamanic journeying, alternative modalities along with talk therapy, antidepressants for a little while. All of these methods, I think, contributed to my healing. But in one of the past life regressions, I know it's crazy, I went into past life regression, honestly, to try to see where Roy and I had maybe met in a previous life, right? Because I thought, gee, that would be interesting. Well, I didn't find Roy in that past life regression. I found another woman who I recognized as a person in my current life. She lived in the castle because she was the healer to the king, and I was her toiling apprentice. It was not a good existence. I felt trapped there. There was no way out. When they took me out of the regression, the hypnotherapist would always ask, so what did you learn from that life? What did you learn from that life that you need to use today? And it was learning to walk away. Yeah, and I think that's been a big part of, even though it might feel risky, you might feel insecure, the abuse might feel familiar, you have to be comfortable with not being comfortable in order to sometimes take a risk to put yourself in a better place.
And you were speaking earlier about specific trauma and how you blamed yourself. And it reminded me of something I think is generally considered true by psychologists, that children under a certain age always blame themselves. They always assume that it's them, that whatever's going on is their fault. The divorce is their fault, or whatever it is. So as adults, we need to find a way to make our way out of that. And children can't always walk away, but an adult can. And that's the great lesson, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. We keep that in our subconscious. Maybe we have these toxic relationships. It isn't always family. It isn't always friends. Maybe it's a toxic relationship with an employer or people, especially people in authority.
You have said, Karen, that you believe that we are all normalizing abuse to survive. Some people might think that that's an exaggeration. I certainly don't. I think it's spot on, but some people might say that. You have done considerable research in your life to bring you to the point where you could write this book from a very qualified perspective, plus your own personal experiences from which you've gained a lot of wisdom. What might you say to people who claim that that's an exaggeration? That's not true.
I was in a circle with some women when I was up on the mountain. I was polling them on the title of my book. So the idea of abuse came up, and a couple of the women said, well, I've never suffered abuse in my life. I can't relate to this. But when then they started talking, and they started maybe talking about their husband or their father, or maybe, the family didn't approve of a life choice they were making, pushback they got. Because, there's a wide spectrum of abuse. I mean, it can go from, just someone, being unkind to you to murder. So there's a wide spectrum in there. It can be neglect. It can be someone telling you you're stupid and you're never going to amount to anything, to, all the other things that happen that rank up there really high, like murder or rape or something like that. And I think when we are abused by people who are close to us, like our family, they'll say, oh, well, we did it for your own good, or we did it because we loved you. Or if we hear something from the pulpit, this is an authority figure. This person speaks for God, right? And especially if they're condemning your lifestyle, or they're marginalizing you because you're a woman, well, you take that in. It affects you. I mean, I think we really need to redefine those sorts of things as abuse. Take, for instance, an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. I think we all think those are pretty normal. They started out, I believe, so companies could protect their intellectual property, so that if an employee left the company, they couldn't take the company's secrets and sell them or share them with somebody else. Well, that's all fine. But we know what happens with NDAs today. Evil people, evil actors getting away with bad deeds.
Right. And silencing their victims.
Exactly. So I think that's a great example of abuse that we normalize. You look at, for instance, corporations. The people who are on the board, or the CEO or the owner, they are protected, they are buffered from what their companies do. If their companies do bad things, the company gets sued, or they held personally accountable for the bad deeds of the corporation, even though they were the ones that made the decisions that the corporation followed through on. I think that's abuse. And I think about the guy who owned that railroad, who, when they had that big derailment, you had this long, like miles and miles of train with 2 people on it to cut costs. They said that they hadn't been doing safety inspections. Yeah, so the company is going to get sued, but what is he going to suffer personally, or him and the board, for making the decisions that led up to that situation? When books are banned, that's abuse. In academia, the gatekeepers to knowledge can be abusive if they keep important things from us. I mean, growing up in the South, I didn't learn the real facts of the Civil War. I didn't learn about Juneteenth. I didn't learn about how the Pope issued the doctrine of discovery, which enabled people coming to the New World to grab for themselves land because the indigenous people here weren't white and weren't Christian. We didn't learn these things. Now they don't want to have women's studies in colleges. They don't want to have African American studies in colleges. And so you see all of these things that I think we just accept as normal and okay. When you really look at it, it's oppressive in some way. It's for someone's agenda, maybe to keep us ignorant, maybe to keep us from revolting, when a corporation puts down a union, so that the workers can't negotiate for better conditions.
The list of corporate abuse goes on, doesn't it? And I think you're so right in that we must redefine what is abuse. Many years ago, I was speaking with my mom about her childhood, and I said, "Do you think you were abused as a child?" Because I certainly have my own opinion based on, knowing my grandmother and based on hearing some stories. And very innocently, she said, "Oh, no, I was never abused." And yet my grandmother seriously abused her, not physically, but you mentioned telling someone they're stupid. My grandmother told her daughter, my mother, that she was stupid almost every day of her life. And my mother did not include that as abuse. She thought that abuse is when you are beaten, when you are physically beaten. So she did not see herself as being abused. She felt that she grew up with a parent that was not abusive. You are so right. We have to redefine what is abuse, what is trauma.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to see the abuse when it comes from people who are caretakers, people who are supposed to love us. Also, too, when you think about employers, if we're dependent on someone for our economic livelihood, it's really difficult sometimes to take the blinders off. Say you work in human resources department, you have maybe 10 positions to fill. The boss tells you, well, I don't want a woman for this position, and I don't want somebody that's over 50 for this, or I don't want any African Americans because they're lazy. Belief systems come into play. Well, that really puts you between a rock and a hard place, doesn't it? Because he's telling you to break the law. Well, when I did the book, Normalizing Abuse, I put a call out to the community, and I said to people, send me little snippets of abuse that happened in your life. And 2 others in the workplace, where one woman sent in how when she was trained on the job, they didn't tell her all the steps in which she had to do. So her work always came up incomplete or wrong. Well, she started to notice how they train the men, and they trained the men, giving them all the steps so the men would succeed, and they set her up for failure. Another woman, she was put in a situation where she had to do some physical labor that normally 2 men would do. But they didn't want her in this job. They thought it was a job for men. So they sent her out there by herself rather than like they would normally send 2 people.
Karen, did the concept of the Saturn return factor into any of this in your journey?
Yes, it really did. That was one of the alternative healing modalities that helped me reflect and look at what happened in my life over the past decades. The first Saturn return, listeners might know, we usually get them at about the age 30. And I didn't know for sure if I was a believer in Saturn return stuff, but I said, what the heck, throw it against the wall, see if it sticks. The first Saturn return was, like I said, about the age 30. And that was actually a time when we did reassess. I mean, I think you can look at a Saturn return as almost the way we look at the fall of the year when we're doing the wheel of the year work, and we take stock and reassess. And it's usually at that time, when we're 30, and then again when we're 60, and maybe if we're lucky to live long enough, and we have all of our faculties at 90, every 30 years or so, we sort of look back at our life. Sometimes it's a time of real change. I look back at my life when I was 30, and I had gone through a tremendous change. Not only did I remarry, but left Louisiana, came to California. I shifted from, some of the listeners may find this surprising, but I'll tell it because I think it's important. I thought Rush Limbaugh was a god. I know.
So you have gone on a transformative journey.
Yeah. So, here I am, a racist, white supremacist, Fox News watching person in Louisiana, because you know what, Ava, I didn't meet anybody except those sorts of people, you know, those are the types of people I was surrounded with. And
That was the culture in which you lived and grew
yes,
up.
yes. And, there was not anything to burst that bubble. There wasn't education to burst that bubble, and there wasn't any outside influences to penetrate. We moved across the country, and now I'm exposed to so much. I mean, the learning curve was exponential. Finding out a spirituality changed everything for me. Left those toxic belief systems behind, and now I'm on this journey. So you could say it was an external change that happened around my first Saturn return, as well as an internal. And then the same thing happened on the second Saturn return at about 60, because that's when all of this upheaval happened. I feel like I went much deeper into who I really am. It became easier for me to walk the goddess talk, just reassessing my whole life up to that point, and coming to these deeper realizations, like I write about in the Normalizing abuse book. On some levels, of course, I knew about the goddess values, and I wanted to live those and walk those and talk those. But having gone through that loss and grief and suffering, I think it changed me fundamentally, gave me so much more empathy and compassion and patience.
You have published 6 books prior to this, all sacred feminine related. This book you have described as where self-help, alternative spirituality, and social justice all meet. Is this a departure from your previous goddess work or an expansion? How does that seem to you?
I think it's more of an expansion. It feels like it's the next step, because the pump was primed, so to speak, with the teachings of Riane Eisler, with the partnership society stuff, with the caring economy stuff, the fact that I was a feminist. And, I knew about patriarchy, I knew about predator capitalism, but now this was looking at things more under a microscope. Sure, I knew predator capitalism was a bad thing, and and it was killing us. Sure, I knew corporations did bad things, employers did bad things, but now I was really starting to zero in on stuff that we just take as normal, that we say, well, that's just the way it is. I think that hurts us when, it's almost like manufactured consent. We become complicit in the abuse, and we don't even know it because we go along with it. Like that person in human resources whose boss wants them to, maybe not hire certain people, and it's not because they couldn't do the job or they're not qualified, but it's age discrimination or gender discrimination, or or racism or something. This was taking those things that we think can't be changed, these things that are just so deeply baked into our culture, into our society, and forcing us to look at them. Because, for instance, income disparity. We all know women make less than men, right? All through their lives. And it ends up, in many cases, 70% of women retire in poverty because of it. Okay, so we use these terms, income disparity, but if we said, no, this is exploitation of women's labor, to me, those words are much more powerful and speak to what is really happening, rather than using the sanitized label.
Right. That are kind of devoid of any emotion or feeling about what the consequences of that action actually are. Yeah.
And we're surrounded by stuff like that. I mean, think about how we've been taught to look at Thanksgiving. I mean, the ultimate gaslighting. We look at Thanksgiving and we want to believe it was this wonderful big dinner between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. And, we don't learn about the blankets with plague, or we don't learn about the discovery doctrine or any of that, and how everything was a commodity to these Europeans hitting the New World.
Literally whitewashed. Yeah.
Yeah, all whitewashed. And I have a theory, having been raised a Catholic and having to go to church on Sunday, right? And when I was in Catholic school, we had to go to Mass in the morning before school started, looking at Jesus on the cross up there. As a Catholic, we were told about his noble sacrifice and suffering. And we were, and it would be a good thing for us to want to emulate that. Well, think about that for a second. Think about that. If that's not an abusive idea to put in someone's head, because if you're told God suffered and sacrificed for you, don't you want to be just like him and be that selfless? That, I think, sets you up to be a doormat. That sets you up to feel like, well, if you suffer, the more you suffer and sacrifice, the more God is going to love me.
Just so insidious.
It is. A lot of Buddhists say something along the lines of life is suffering. If we go through life thinking, well, life is suffering, then when someone abuses us or exploits us, we just go, well, life is suffering. What am I, there's
nothing we can do about it.
I know. So you see what I'm talking about, the normalization of domination, oppression. It's just everywhere.
One of the questions that we were going to ask you was about, is this book specific to women's issues and domestic violence, or is it more overarching about the entire system of patriarchy? And I think you've begun to answer that.
There was some confusion. I do know some people sort of just got the impression this is all about domestic violence. And in fact, I was going to call the book Battered and Bruised, but I didn't want that title because it even further reinforced the wrong idea that this is just about women's abuse. No, it isn't. I mean, it starts out, I talk about my own journey so that people realize I'm speaking from someone who lived it, rather than somebody just read about it in a book and then, I was in it. I wasn't detached from it. And then what I did was I divided the book into chapters. There's a chapter on academia, religion, corporations, the military, social media, families and friends, society and culture. I probably missed one or two there, but I look at all of these different aspects as lightly as I can. I mean, I make references to movies and things that are happening in the world. It's not just this grim account of one abuse after another. I talk about Outlander in it and all sorts of different things. Look at these different areas of our life that touch us and say, well, look at this abuse. This is something we've just been normalizing. Do you know about that? It was really intended to awaken people, just kind of rattle their cage a little bit, because until we're aware of it, I don't think we do anything about it. And then to give steps and suggestions about, well, then how do you break free? What are some resources? What are some values? What are some ideas that maybe we could start thinking about we need in our society to counteract the pervasive abuse and exploitation that's normalized?
So obviously, you have done a tremendous amount of personal work to come to these understandings that have qualified you to write this book. And you've shared a few of the techniques that you employed to personally escape trauma and facilitate the healing process. Can you tell us if there's more to share on that? Can you share that? And also, do you have any other remedies that you might suggest from a more societal perspective to either avoid abuse completely or heal from trauma and abuse and exploitation?
Well, I don't want to, be Pollyanna or give people the idea I'm looking for some utopia, because I don't think we can escape all abuse and suffering. But there's an awful lot of it we could probably cut out of our life and improve our quality of life. So I do want to say that I'm not, I'm pragmatic and I'm realistic, but I'm sure everyone has something that they could change in their life for the better, or they may see where they have been abusing someone and maybe they can make a correction. I think where it starts is self-care. And that means a lot of things. It means, especially for women, we're so used to being the caring mother, sometimes to the detriment of ourselves. We don't look out for ourselves when we should be putting the oxygen mask on ourselves first. As part of self-care, I think we do have to reflect on our life and have the courage to look at our life with the blinders off and be willing to see what's happened to us, and maybe how what's happened to us has affected the decisions we've made. Be honest, put the shame aside, because there's nothing to be shameful about. It starts with self-care. Part of that self-care, I think, is learning to be in gratitude, because I think when we're in gratitude, it's like a magic bullet. Not only is our body flooded with these endorphins and we feel better, but I think it makes it easier to cope. And I think it makes it a lot harder to hate people when you are in gratitude about your life. I think practicing generosity and kindness, being accepting and tolerant, I think all of those things factor into our self-care. And we're magical people. We know about energetics. If we are practicing those sorts of energies, I think that's the sort of energy that's going to come back to us. I think it's also about educating ourselves. That's crucial. Part of that education is looking at the belief systems you grew up with to see the toxicity, like I left behind racism and white supremacy and that sort of thing. Be willing to look at that and say, gee, I'm kind of ashamed I thought that stuff, but that's not who I am anymore. I've course corrected. And education and maybe in some of these other areas of life. So when the politician is lying to you. So when academia isn't teaching you about capitalism. We really have to be more present about who we are and what we want. Because I would imagine that some people don't even know who their authentic self is, because they've been told their entire life from who they're expected to be by society, by their family, by religion.
There's also a lot of lying in families. My mother accepted the lie that she had a happy childhood when further exploration showed that she actually did not, but she wanted to believe that so much. And she was told that by adults, by her parents, by others around her. Yes, you had a great childhood. But then when we actually started exploring it together, that was completely not true. And it was shocking to her. And it was hard for her to stop telling that lie. It was hard for her to believe that her parents were abusive. But she was brave. And she was able to come to that. And I think that's part of what your work is doing, is helping people come to the truth, because until you stop lying, you can't really begin to heal, can you?
No, because families have secrets, they have skeletons in the closet. My uncle, my mother's brother, used to wear pancake makeup. And the whole family said, oh, well, he just likes movie stars. Well, he never had a successful relationship with a woman. And I have come to the realization my poor uncle was probably gay at a time when that would have just been unheard of, he committed suicide. The family still will not look at that. I have an evangelical cousin, and when I suggested to her that Uncle Anthony might have been gay, oh my God.
They cannot face that reality.
No, cannot face that
There's so much reality about fathers and uncles sexually abusing daughters that is just erased, just wiped off the family map. And that has to be faced for a lot of women also, doesn't it?
It does. And I mean, and look, and I don't think we should become victims, but I think we even have to look at the small things, maybe the neglect. I mean, I grew up in a family where my mother was rather cold. Our relationship was a list of chores on the refrigerator. I mean, we didn't have much money, but I mean, did we ever go out and have fun as a family and have a picnic? No. Did they come to my graduation, even though I graduated third out of 300? No. Did they come to my baseball games or she even read my books? No. And that used to really bother me. But I look back on it now and I believe my mother did the best she could for who she was. I have forgiven her, but I'm sure that impacted me somewhere where my parents were always absent for the accomplishments in my life. So I don't think we discount stuff like that either. It leaves a little scar, and that scar may make us think, well, our accomplishments have no value if your parents don't even show up to clap for you. You asked about the external world too, outside of just our personal life. I think that there's, aside from really taking in and living the values of the sacred feminine, I think there are other things that we can also do. Look at how the opinion has shifted about greed. Greed used to be one of the 7 deadly sins. Well, now greed has been normalized. Well, I think we have to claw that back and make greed a sin and taboo again. We have to change our values and how we think. They're doing experiments around the country with guaranteed yearly income. If a person knew they had a stipend enough that they could keep a roof over their head and food on their table, then maybe they don't have to stay at the abusive employer, or maybe they can pursue their art and their passion. Studies have shown that it takes such stress off of people when they aren't living hand to mouth and don't know where tomorrow's meal is going to come from.
You believe that possibly some form of universal basic income could be an abuse reliever?
I think it could, but the devil's always in the details. Who's going to decide what that guaranteed yearly income is? There's a place to start, and it's showing good results. Like Riane Eisler's idea of a caring economy, where instead of women who have maybe not worked outside the home their entire life, so therefore don't have Social Security to depend on when they retire, something needs to be looked at and done about that as well, because otherwise, are we valuing families? There needs to be an adjustment for that. If we just look at our Scandinavian neighbors, who they say are the happiest people on earth, sure, they pay more taxes, but they get so much more for their money. Their education is free, their medical is free, they have child care. I think they have 3 or 4 weeks vacation. Here, sometimes employers make you feel guilty for taking vacation, or they'll work you 38 hours instead of 40, so they don't have to pay you any benefits. We're the most productive workforce on the planet, and we get the least benefit for it. And that's another way that we need to educate ourselves about that, because that's democratic socialism. But if you go out into the world and you say the words democratic socialism, all people hear is socialism, which they've been brainwashed to think is a terrible, bad thing. Their minds aren't even open to something that could make their lives better.
You have a lot of credits to your name, but you're not specifically a psychologist. Can you share a little bit about from what perspective you did write this book?
Yeah, I don't want people to think by any stretch of the imagination, I'm trying to step on the toes of licensed practitioners. I say very clearly in the book that I'm sort of approaching this as an every woman social scientist, amateur. But that doesn't stop me from being able to understand why people do the things they do. Ideas like, groupthink or tribalism or Christian nationalism. We could use our critical thinking to understand why people do the things we do, brain science. And I do talk about that in one of the chapters and give examples. For instance, people say, well, how could Germans have ever supported Hitler? Psychologists have looked into that, and I talk about that in my book. I did a lot of research and came back and shared it with readers in easy to understand language that helps us understand personality types and ideas that we get caught up in, like groupthink, which makes me think about QAnon people. And I think it's helpful to have, sort of that psychology from the perspective of in every person, explaining it so it's easy to understand. So there's that in the book. I also talk about whistleblowers, because whistleblowers are the ultimate warrior or warrioress standing up to abuse and exploitation. It takes a lot of courage to be a whistleblower, but wow, what would we do without so many of them?
And I notice our culture has some pretty specific ways of punishing whistleblowers, which is just more abuse, isn't it?
Yeah. And the book does have a lot of ideas for healing yourself and resources. So it's like, okay, things are pretty messed up, but there's a lot of hope.
You have brought a much needed perspective. Yes, there are a lot of heavily researched scientific books about trauma and abuse, and I've read a few of them, and many of them are quite cold and analytical, and using that language you referred to a few minutes ago that just sort of strips away all emotion and feeling about what the actual effects are. But I think you bring to this topic a unique perspective with your understanding of the power of partnership and your work with Riane Eisler and understanding that, and with your historical knowledge of what has gone before in goddess community and goddess cultures of ancient times. Your historical knowledge is quite deep, and that must surely inform your work and give you a perspective that the average psychologist would not have. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so, because for instance, just the groundbreaking Chalice and the Blade that Riane Eisler wrote. I don't think the average person ever has access to that, and that book changed my life. That put me on this path. It's Riane's fault. But when we look back and see that there were other cultures that were egalitarian, that didn't just have a male face of God. In the Minoans, we believe their culture put their resources to the common good. We do have guideposts in the past for how things can be. And that really dispels the idea that it's always been this way and there's no other choice.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for bringing that forward. Humans have lived in other ways, haven't they?
Yeah, and I mean, I know when I interviewed Heidi, Gottner Abendroth on my podcast, and we talked about her book, Matriarchal Societies, another hugely important book, eye-opening. We talked about the pushback that she would get on that book because it's like people wanted it swept under the rug. They don't want knowledge out there. And I think knowledge is such an important tool for us to have in our toolkit, because then we can't be duped.
One of the hidden benefits of not acknowledging that humans have and can live in different ways is you no longer can have the excuse of, well, this is just the way humans are. Now,
Yeah.
too bad. You can't use that excuse once you find out about the things that you know, the things that Heidi Gettner Abendroth knows, the things that Rayanne Eisler knows. Once you know those things, you can't say that anymore.
Well, when I was growing up, my mother did tell me one thing. My mother wasn't all bad. I got good from her as well as pain. She said, knowledge is power. And I really didn't understand what that meant as it was being drilled into my head, but I so understand it once I learned about patriarchy and predator capitalism and the history that we're talking about of humanity. Knowledge is power, because when we educate ourselves about this sort of stuff, when the person comes along and says, well, humans have always been violent, we can say, oh, no. Let's dispel that misinformation, along with all the rest. And I think it helps us psychologically as well, because we know that there is hope, that we're not destined to keep this up, that there are other methods, proven methods, and I think it leaves us with hope. And that's important. We need hope.
Absolutely. What do you hope people will get out of this book specifically?
If this book helps one person, change their life, have a better quality of life, I will feel happy for it. I just want people to stop keeping their head down, enduring the things that they don't have to endure. I mean, some of these abuses and exploitations, they're baked into the system. So that it takes longer to change stuff like that. But if we just start small, we don't have to turn the apple cart of our life over in one day, right? But if we just start by looking, giving ourselves permission to look and see the truth and the reality without shame, without anger, that's where we start. And then we can start an exit strategy. Ava, I remember when I was teaching cakes for the Queen of Heaven at the temple.
Fantastic. I remember it well. That was fantastic.
This young woman came up to me at one of the breaks in tears and said, I hear everything you're saying and I believe it with all my heart. She said, but I can't listen to anymore. She said, I've got to go home now because I can't really think about it, because I know for me to embrace these ideas, I'm going to want to make changes in my life. And that means I'm going to be going up against my parents, my in-laws, and my husband.
Wow.
And I think about her often, because, you can't unring the bell.
Yes, right.
Once you know. And I hope that young woman found some ways to reconcile what she learned that day with where she was in life. And I hope she's happy today.
If nothing else, you planted a deep seed that she could not unhear, that will eventually, maybe not now, but eventually cause her to change the course of her life somehow. I truly believe that.
And I guess the only other thing I would want the book to show is how abuse and exploitation really does traumatize people. Because I think there are people who want to minimize the idea of trauma. I know when I told someone who I don't know whether he wasn't very smart or he wanted to just minimize what I had gone through, because I was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress, after the stun gun incident. He said to me, "Oh, trauma. So you think you're a soldier now? You've been in war?" But I think we have to really look at trauma, because I can't help but think all of these people dying of fentanyl overdoses, and are they medicating themselves because they're enduring so much abuse in their lives?
That's what Dr. Gabor Mate believes, and I think he's right. They are self-medicating for unprocessed trauma and abuse, trying to find a way to ameliorate the pain of all that they have not yet been able to deal with.
Yeah. And there needs to be more support for mental health out there. I mean, I know growing up in the South, and I mean, it may be different now. I haven't been there in a long time, but you didn't tell people you were seeing a therapist. That was kind of a taboo subject, especially.
I remember when I was a child, that was a shameful thing that you didn't admit to others.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, we just really have to change our outlook about so many things, and it starts with us.
Well, you are a woman doing exactly that, helping us to change that. And we are so grateful to you. We really miss your presence here in Southern California. How is your life in Oregon? How are things for you right now?
I never imagined I would be here, but I am so glad to be here. We really love it. It has been really good for both Roy's mental health and my mental health. It's beautiful. It's lush. I felt like I was drying up on the vine in California with the heat and the arid temperatures, where I was living the last few years. The people are so nice. It's really been a good move for us. I like it a lot.
I am so glad. So, Karen, does goddess or the sacred feminine still play a significant role in your life?
She sure does. Our living room is an Egyptian temple, and Isis and all the other goddesses just permeate the house. We've started a goddess circle here once a month in Southern Oregon. Back to my podcast, which I feel like is an umbrella of many voices of the sacred feminine. The podcast came back in January after that hiatus. I've been starting to teach here again about the sacred feminine as deity, archetype, and ideal. I gave a presentation at the Unitarian Universalist Church about who are these apparitions that appear all around the world? Who could that possibly be? Yeah, it's a big part of my life as a goddess, as deity, archetype, and ideal. Although with everything going on in the world, sometimes I think the values and ideals are what the world needs the most. As long as people are practicing the ideals, that's what's most important. I find people are really surprised when they find how diverse and rich goddess spirituality can be. It's not just some story they heard in grade school about Hera, the petulant wife of Zeus, that it goes so much deeper and can be such an incredible tool for their transformation.
Right. Well, now that your major work, your latest major work, Normalizing Abuse, is successfully out there in the public realm, are you taking a break, or are you starting to think about what your next piece will be, what your next book will be, what you're working on next?
Oh, it's funny you're saying, are you taking a break? Every author knows that once the book is written, the marketing, which is the hardest work, that actually begins. Since January, I have been learning how to build a website and create memes, to create content. My work now is marketing the book. I don't have plans for another one at this point, but who knows?
I have a feeling something is going to occur to you.
Well, we'll see. I've got my hands full with doing the radio show again every week, taking care of Roy because he still has deficiencies. We have 2 new kittens.
Oh.
So now we have three feline daughters. I have a whole new area to teach about the sacred feminine. I'm doing my best to spread the word.
Well, you are marvelous. It has been a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you today, to hear your thoughts, to experience a deeper level of your latest work, to learn from your perspective, which is a very wise and very helpful and healing one. I think you've done so much for decades to make the world a better place. I've witnessed some of it. We are truly in awe of you. We are very grateful for your wisdom, your insights, and your generous heart in sharing what can help us all. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Ava.